Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 206. And today it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, I'm going back to a podcast that we have discussed before, and that is the Happiness Lab with Dr. Laurie Santos. Mm-hmm. And this one, she has a guest on there who is one of the editors and one of the primary contributors to the World Happiness Report. And the World Happiness Report comes out each year, and it is based on 3 years of compilation of data each time that it comes out. So it kind of tracks change over time. And it's really looking at happiness across the world. So the guest's name is John Helliwell, and he is actually out of the Vancouver School of Economics, I believe. So this actually comes from looking at financial well-being and financial status in the world, but really looking at happiness. And sometimes when people hear this, they think it just means emotional happiness, like, did you feel sad yesterday or did you feel happy yesterday? And he makes sure to kind of clarify that there's another meaning of happiness, and that is overall contentedness with other factors of what is life like there? What is life like for you? How happy are you with how life is for you versus how often do you feel the happy emotion? So that was an important clarification he made, because some people think that this report is really just kind of fluff. We're just looking at people's reported affect, and that's really not what this is about. So what does the study look at? The study looks at 6 main criteria of happiness. And I think it's interesting, he also clarifies it's not someone else looking at the country's well-being and happiness. It is self-report by the people. So if you want to know people's level of happiness, talk to the people. And that's what this study does. And it started being published, I think, in 2011. So we are down the road a bit with this and have had lots of reports shared so far. But the 6 criteria that the happiness report is based on. First is income or financial, and that is based on the GDP, which is the total sum of goods and services provided divided by the number of people. The next is life expectancy. So that is one way of kind of looking at overall health in the country. The next is freedom of choice. And you're going to notice some of these are about political well-being and how people perceive that in their country. So freedom of choice, freedom from corruption, social connection, and generosity. And I don't remember exactly when I had listened to this, but I remember years ago listening to something about this of, it's really just saying what country is the happiest and which country is the least happy. And I remember they gave an example of this, and they said Italy on other reports is pretty happy, but the freedom from corruption.
I was going to say, I bet that one's not good in Italy. Sorry, Italy.
That one really knocked it down on its overall rating. And so again, looking at, it's not just, okay, where are the wealthiest people? And actually what I was just talking about was a study looking at the happiest people, not even the countries. But they did talk about that. So if you live in a country where you have a lot of fear of corruption and doubt that things are being done appropriately, it takes a toll on your level of overall happiness. One of the things about this episode that I thought was important is it doesn't just explain what does this study look at and who's the happiest and who's the least happy. And actually, the guest, John, talked about the fact that in the beginning, they did not even put rankings because that wasn't their intent. It wasn't so that we can rank countries by levels of happiness. But of course, that's what people wanted. Even governments want that because, of course, it's nice to know, hey, we're number 5 on the list of happiest countries in the world. Or how do we improve our number? And also, sometimes individuals want competition. They want to be the better. They want to be in the happier country. They don't want to go to a less happy country. And so they did start putting rankings on this after, I think, a couple of years. So,
how long have they been running it?
Since 2010 or 2011. I can't remember which one.
Okay.
So, any guesses? The happiest country? You might already know because you've probably looked at some of this before.
No, I don't know. I would guess it's one of the Scandinavian countries.
Absolutely. It is Finland, and it was Finland last year as well. Not too many years ago, it was Denmark. So the 5 Scandinavian countries always score very high. So of course, for many of us, that's something to look at. Why is it that they score high? I think the takeaway from this, and I'll talk about some specific takeaways as we go through this episode, but the takeaways really are, how do I work on improving the overall happiness of me and my surroundings, rather than how do I get to the country that has the best rating? So one of the examples he says is, just because Finland has such a high rating doesn't mean we should all move to Helsinki.
No.
That's not the solution, but we should look at what makes people there happier in their lives. What is it? What is the quality of life there that we all want to work on emulating more?
Or contented. Like you said at the beginning, I think contented is probably a better word to use.
That's right. Unfortunately, that is a good point, that using the term happiness makes people look at, oh my gosh, everyone in Helsinki must be so happy. And he said, look, people in Finland are not walking around saying, oh my gosh, look, everyone's smiling and laughing all the time. But if you ask them, how happy are you with life here? How is life for you? The ratings are very high.
How contented are you with your life?
That's right. So the first one of the financial, I think, is an important one, and not because the richer the country, the more happy.
Oh, I think I know where this is going. Yeah.
There are other countries that have more money. That's why it's a formula. They look at these 6 factors, but the financial is important because it's really about, can you afford the necessities in life? Can you afford safe housing? Can you afford education? Can you afford any leisure time? That makes a big difference. Not, do you have billions and mansions all over the world? That's not what they're really looking at. Can people afford the things in life that make life a little easier to live? If you don't know that you're going to have food next week, rating your overall life satisfaction high is more challenging. Life expectancy, obviously. Health, wellness, physical wellness is important. And then again, the freedom of choice and freedom of corruption. I'm not going to go into that as much, and they didn't go into it as much, but obviously has a lot to do with political structures, people's sense of autonomy. Can I make choices, or is everything controlled for me? Plays a role here. And then the big one that we are going to touch on is social connection, that being such an important one. And interestingly, generosity played such an important role. When he was talking about the Scandinavian countries and their trend of scoring high, he talked about this generosity piece being really a significant factor because it's kind of in their culture. It's kind of in their way of not only making sure that everyone around them is well, but also reaching out. Are other countries well? Are others doing well? And I don't have the statistics on this, but for example, Finland ranks very high in the amount of untied contributions they make toward other countries and other groups. So they do a lot of giving and supporting. The other thing that factors in, and I don't remember if it was just under social connection or where it played a role in how they measured this, but they recently started using a question of, if you dropped your wallet, do you think it would be returned to you? And what they found is In countries where the ratings on that were higher, yes, those countries tended to be, they rated higher on the happiness report. Countries where they did not believe they would get their wallet back, you can imagine they started going lower and lower on the rating. So this idea of trust, can you trust your fellow people? Can you trust your government? Can you trust, agencies and things? But this one was really an important one that they're starting to look at more, and especially around social connection, because they're not just talking about social connection to avoid loneliness. And I know you and I have talked a couple of times about that loneliness is such a significant contributor to worse health outcomes, less life expectancy, all of those things. But they said this isn't only about loneliness, it's, do you believe you have support available when needed? And if you believe this, you can tolerate a little more loneliness. It almost balances that out a little bit. So sometimes people think, oh, we just need to stamp out loneliness. And, he shared that it's not only the absence of loneliness that improves people's lives. It is this belief in social support, this sense that if needed, someone will help me. Someone will return my wallet. If I get in an accident, someone will stop and get me care. Those kinds of things. Now, one of the things, I am always a critic whenever I hear anything like this, and I think this goes back to grad school and looking at research and how we look at things, what concepts we're trying to measure and how we measure them, and the fact that we can't rule out all the variables. So I even look at something like this and I think, okay, let's look in the US, because that's the closest reference I have. One of the examples they shared is, do you have family or neighbors or friends that could help you? Well, in much of the world, I know for sure in the US, we are moving more and more toward not living near family. We have a little more global lifestyle, and we are not as centered on living near our family as we used to be, or where some cultures are still more centered on that. And so I think, are they looking at that? Does it matter if you live in a country that holds the value of living closer to family versus not? And does that affect the happiness rating? So I know I've just kind of touched on some brief things about this. And like I said, they did not go into tons of detail. But the biggest thing they really focus on is, how can we as individuals affect the happiness around us? And they really talked about this social connection thing. And unfortunately, and he really highlighted, this is not just because of COVID. Of course, COVID made this more of an issue in certain areas. But as we have been inundated with more images of what goes wrong in life, of crime, of, all of the negatives, social media and news being accessible all the time, we've actually started to shut down the mechanisms of social connection. We've shut our doors more. We have kids locked up at school now because there are so many school issues, at least in the US, violence in schools and school shootings and things. So of course, we respond to that with trying to increase safety and decrease risk. But what we also do in that is we cut off social connection. So their big push for all of us is to think about our more local environments. How can we help our happiness in those environments, but also affect the overall happiness in that environment? Issues at work. How can we work on the social climate at work, the safety at work? Rather than closing doors at work, how can we open? How can we learn to rely on each other more and trust each other more? And simple things like, and I know it sounds very hokey, but when you go outside your home and you see people on the sidewalk, do you smile or do you look away and cross the street? The more we're inundated with negative images, of course, the more we're likely to look down and cross the street. But that erodes our social connection and that environmental trust, that trust that there are other people who care. So when they talked about this dropping of the wallet example, I thought this was kind of interesting. One of the challenges of this is that we tend at this point, again, because of much of the negative information that we're given constantly, we tend to underrate people's willingness to give it back. We attribute more negative intent to people and less positive. So it's hard to have a sense of trust and social support when we have this negative bias. And what they really find when they dig into this more is we generally, and not just in certain countries, but overall, we are moving in this tradition of we underestimate the kindness, the helpfulness, the generosity of others. And yet it is our generosity and the generosity of our community that helps us rate higher in overall satisfaction in life. So there's this conflict for us. We want to see more generosity. We want to believe more generosity, and we want to be a part of it. But what we're really shown is don't. It's not safe. It's not going to happen. People are not kind. People do not help. And so we're in this mix here. And then the last thing that I thought was really interesting that they shared is across ages. And they've really started looking at this more in the past few years. And that is that it used to be, there are certain countries, let's say, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, if they broke it down by age in the past, there was not a lot of difference between the young and the old. But over time, the young actually rank higher in happiness scores, while the older generations still rank pretty low. So we see a bigger divide there. In the US, we see it the opposite.
Oh, really?
The older generations have a little more satisfaction, and the younger generations have less. And, they talked about some possible ways of viewing that. But I think in general, younger generations are more socially aware now than when I was young, and maybe when our predecessors were younger. But this idea that we're starting to see shifts and bigger gaps across the ages in certain countries. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the other last thing they just talked about is who's moving up and who's moving down, because that seems important. Probably 3 of the bigger moves down were Germany, Canada, and the US. And one of the big movers up was Costa Rica. And he had said, it's interesting because they used to be higher and then they dipped down and now have climbed back up. But I think it was Canada went from number 4 down to number 15.
Wow.
And the US went from number 11 down to number 23 or 24. So pretty significant shift downward. And again, this isn't just last year, or it wasn't just because of COVID. This trend has been happening over years. And remember, they report every year, but it's based on a 3-year average. So, you can really start to see this trend. So the biggest takeaway that I took from this is to be focused on improving social connections in my life and in my surrounding areas, my work environment, my neighborhoods, my larger community, and as much as I can, voting for things that also encourage that.
Yes, I think it's one of those things, isn't it, that works both ways. It works top down. It's important, and it needs to top down and bottom up. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, I was out to dinner with some friends yesterday evening, and we were discussing whether it was a theory or whether it must have been one of the Scandinavian countries had started putting it into practice. And I must Google it actually. But I remember reading about it and the debate around whether there should be this national income minimum that everyone has. Whether you're working or you're not working, there's just this minimum amount that everybody is entitled to. And of course, you can imagine the debate that comes up around this. Oh, so we're just going to pay people to do nothing. And of course, there will be, some people, there'll always be a minority that does that and for whatever reason. But the overall sort of the drive from the opinion from the other side was that if you just remove that worry, you remove that stress, you level the playing field to a certain extent to the level of contentment, if you like, that, as you were saying at the beginning, that you have somewhere safe to live, you have enough to eat. If you remove the worry for that, it frees you up to do other things. It frees you up to maybe pursue a passion that you have, to pursue some more varied education or higher level of education, to do this, to do that, to volunteer. Not necessarily go out. Some people would take that opportunity to be entrepreneurial and think up a new business idea and make money. And someone else might think, okay, well, I don't need to generate money for myself. I'm going to spend my time volunteering, or I'm going to do this or that. It's interesting what it can throw up if you just remove that stress, and so you hit that financial contentment scale. Yes, and it's no coincidence that in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, there are things like, yes, there's higher income tax, but there are more generous social payments, and there's more generous maternity, paternity leave, and all these things. The shorter working week, the debate around that often comes up from these countries, and the benefits of it. And, instead of having that cynical, oh, well, people work less. Now, actually, it's been shown that people can achieve the same amount in a shorter time, but then you get this better family, leisure, work balance. So there's that top down, but then there's also that bottom up. Then there are things that you can do locally. I've mentioned it many times on this podcast, and I should imagine most places these days have a local give and takery group on Facebook. And, as I've just said, I've mentioned it before. We've talked about it before. Give and takery. People ask for things and people give things away for all sorts of reasons. And it's heartwarming. And often in there, you'll see things like, yes, someone's wallet's been found and we're trying to find the owner, or someone's dropped this watch, or someone's lost this, and they're trying to reunite things. And it's heartwarming. And it is a reminder that there are kind people out there, there are generous people out there, there are people that want to help. So I think it's a good thing to tap into something like that. So you're not just seeing the negative stuff that you see on the news, but you can see the positive, and especially if it's local, because it could be that person I just passed in the street who did that really nice thing that I saw in the Facebook group the other day. You never know who around you is going to reach out that hand to help somebody else.
That's right.
So yes, I can see that feels like that generosity and the helping people level up a bit financially. Those feel very important to me. But I can see why in different places, those different criteria would be more important, like other things like you mentioned, like corruption and freedom of choice. And, that could be overwhelming. Of course, a lot of these things we take for granted. If you couldn't take it for granted, I can see it bringing your happiness scale down a long, long way.
That's right. And I think you just highlighted this too. So let's say I live in a place where corruption or trust of officials is not easy to do. I need to work on my other senses of trust and building smaller sense of
local
community.
Trust. Yeah.
Yeah. To try and buffer that. And unfortunately, some of those local groups, I know there's one here in the US that a lot of people are on, everything on is like strange person seen in the neighborhood, beware, lock all your doors, kids doing that, it's just like negative. And so it just increases. I have to be wary of everyone around here. And I get why it starts, but you can see how negatively it affects us over time when that's all we're exposed to. So I think, like you said, getting involved in some ways that you get to see the positive, you get to see, even the news. Gosh, it's nice if the news would just even report more and more positive things happening, people doing good things for the community versus, danger, this happened last week. And, So that was my takeaway about this whole report. Not that I'm going to move to Finland, though that wouldn't be a bad idea, but that I want to keep working on the happiness around me in my life.
Wouldn't that be good if the news, because obviously they've got to report on what's happening and there are lots of bad things happening, but wouldn't it be good if they made a point of having, a bit like doing a gratitude journal, if they made a point of having to report on some kind of nice story? be it a story of generosity or a story of hope or a story, something positive. They had to find something every day that they were reporting on the news, that there was just that little segment, that little thing that they left you with at the end. Yeah, this is all the crap that's going on, but here's a really nice, heartwarming story to leave you with. It would help, wouldn't it? So there's an idea for you out there, newscasters. This is what we think you should do.
There we go. So I hope everyone could gain something from this, not so much about how do you necessarily fix your country, but how can you increase the happiness in your area, in your life and those around you, and take some active steps. Until we meet again, I hope that you're able to take some steps in these directions.
You stole my line. I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.